Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. We're approaching our 200th episode. So how should we celebrate? 200 hardening steps for Kubernetes, 200 cross-site scripting payloads, the 200 Java CVEs that have come out in the past 6 months. We'll see. Which means this week, we talk with Dr. Chenxi Wang about ways to help developers deal with supply chain security and boards to understand why that's so important. In the news segment, Java's ECDSA is like nothing you've seen. Seeing the inside of a Linux kernel RCE, seeing Okta's breach from the outside, seeing a path for bounties, and more. Be seeing you, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
This is episode 194, recorded April 25th, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hey, sir, how are you doing? Happy another Monday morning.
Happy another Monday morning. Love the t-shirt as well, by the way. Good visuals for us this week. Something different. You can also, speaking of 200, you can save $100 on your RSA Conference 2022 full conference pass. RSA will be live in San Francisco, June 6th through 9th. Security Weekly will be there in full force, delivering real-time live coverage and interviewing some of the event's top speakers and sponsors. Register with our discount code by visiting securityweekly.com/RSA2022 and using the word 52UCyber. We'll see you there. And do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Dr. Chenxi Wang is the founder and general partner of Rain Capital, a Silicon Valley-based venture fund focused on enterprise software and cybersecurity investments. A well-known operator, technologist, and thought leader in the cybersecurity industry, Dr. Wang is a member of the board of directors for MDU Resources, a Fortune 500 company. Previously, Chenxi was chief strategy officer at Twistlock, VP of strategy for Intel Security, and VP of research for Forrester. Chenxi was recognized as a woman of influence by the SC Magazine, Women Tech Founders, and Cyber Risk Alliance. Hello, Chenxi. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to be here because you've set up a conversation, I think, for us about why security, supply chain security in particular, is important to developers. But I think you can bring us a really interesting perspective from the board level, from the top down, having conversations with boards, with CISOs about how do we translate that importance of supply chain for developers, figuring out what tools they should have, but educating the people who are making those investments. So before we get into some of those areas, though, maybe just start us off with maybe a real quick hint or summary of why supply chain, surprise, is going to be important for developers, boards, CISOs alike.
Well, one of the things is we had many attacks of late that exploited the third-party software vector as an attack angle. And that's not surprising to many of us who have been in cybersecurity for a while and who are also, for me, my background is AppSec. So this, we know for a long time that third-party libraries, third-party software is used extensively in many companies' applications and software. So it's just time that vector is exploited, and we think it's going to get worse. So that's why it's an important thing, not just for the attacks that are happening, but for the potential of how bad it could be.
Yeah, and part of it is, maybe we obviously pay attention to the news. We understand a lot of the attacks that you're alluding to that have happened. But then also, an organization like NIST comes out and the White House comes out with directives on supply chain. And I suspect these types of frameworks, standards, directives are the types of things that start to get the executive level leadership or boards to set up and be like, maybe asking the questions, or maybe here's the question for you. Are they asking the questions? Is this something we should be paying attention to? What does this mean for us?
Mm-hmm. Boards and top management should absolutely be asking the question about what are we doing about third-party software risk, third-party software security. Now, this is part of a larger risk discussion. The board is all about managing risks for the company, and this is emerging as a risk vector that's not typically dealt with at the technology level and also at the board level, right? So in the past, if you know, secure software development is about first-party development, about securing your software development practices in-house. But many people don't recognize is that even though you may have a large team of software developers, they are using a ton of third-party libraries, and that libraries are pulled down from the internet, built into your software images, and distributed to your customer. So whether you are the original producer of software or you're the conduit of third-party libraries to your customer, this supply chain impacts everyone. And sometimes we are even critically, I would say, actually many of us are critically dependent on third-party libraries that you may not necessarily know the origin, or you don't know the provenance of it, who's developing it, who's contributing to it, is it in good maintenance stand, all those things that we need to know in order to manage risks. And of course, at the board level, you don't necessarily ask that nitty-gritty detailed questions, but you should ask, do we have a strategy as a company to deal with third-party software risks, and do we have adequate investment to implement that strategy so our risk is mitigated?
So I'd love to pick apart some of that investment aspect in the sense of, like you're alluding, you as organizations can be surprised, for example, of where did Log4j suddenly end up in these third-party hardware appliances, all these third-party bits of software. And I think it's safe to say that you can't invest in, this is the one asset management tool that's going to solve the problem. So the CISO needs to come in and say, we need to invest in a tool, or we need to do some investments. But how does that story evolve in the sense of, or going beyond just we can't just buy a tool and this solves the problem, nor I think, as you're also talking about the developer aspect, can we buy a tool that's necessarily just for security to use? So tell us a bit more about how does that, how do you pitch an investment to the board that the CISO needs money, needs to stand up a program that's going to make a difference?
Right. And the question you asked has many different aspects, and let me just tease that apart a little bit. So traditionally, application security is handled by the security organization, right? So you have a CISO, and his or her organization may have a subset of the team that is dedicated to application security. And what does the application security do? They try to implement tools and processes within software development lifecycle to ensure that the software that the company produces is at least free of critical vulnerabilities. And that's what AppSec is about. Now, the traditional AppSec tools, and I would say processes included, are typically geared towards AppSec teams. So the scanners for AppSec teams use, the results that are produced are for AppSec team to consume. And guess what? The AppSec teams do not remediate software. They do not write software. They typically do not patch it. They typically do not say, hey, how are we going to remediate this in the next sprint? Who's doing that? The developers. right? So the tools and utilities of which that does AppSec tasks, if they do not, if they are not produced for developers to use, meaning that some of them could be too complex or too security nerdy, if that's even a word. And developers will look at this and say, hey, it's just not a tool that I understand how to use or speaks my language. And they'll just simply not use it. And when that happens, there is a friction and a gap between what security wants and what developer wants. And that is just not going to be amendable for your organization to produce secure software. So one of the things which is a passion for me is to see security tools and technology that are developed and packaged, if you will, for the adjacent roles to security, for developers, for ops, for network engineers, for those folks that we work with, but not quote unquote security, for them to actually become security users and security champions. And that is, I think, a critical way for us to actually be more secure as an industry, as a community.
So I'd love to dig a little deeper here on this. We've got someone here who's Chenxi's done, Dr. Chenxi Wang has done so much amazing stuff, over the last decade or two. And part of what you've been working on, Chenxi, is with a VC hat on as an investor. And we talked a little bit about the board setting and how we're rolling down into what the developers do and the tools they should be using and things like that. Our listener base is some mixture of developers and security practitioners. I'd love to hear from your point of view, when you're mostly early stage, I think the investments you've done in Rain. Yeah. If for an early stage company, say pre-A, and this might be more for Enterprise Security Weekly, so folks, excuse me for going off topic, but I think this is really interesting. For someone to do a decent spend on anything, it's probably going to get some sort of board review either before or after the fact. So as someone who's writing some of those checks that are going into these companies, I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about, how soon should people be thinking about spending for some of these tools, or should they be using something open source, or what do you see in the companies you're working with, or what would you recommend if you're sitting on a board meeting and the CTO is talking about he's not sure about how secure the application is, or are we going to too much trouble or too little trouble, or all these sort of things. What sort of your thoughts on it from that point of view? So sort of not just looking at it as a board seat, but like literally the person writing the check for some of these cases. Right. I think that'd be sort of interesting. Yeah.
So I'm an early stage investor, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning that I write checks for companies that are seed and A and very little on Series B. What means that those companies typically the process is not mature. The strategy is also evolving. So those companies, a lot of them don't even have a dedicated security team, let alone AppSec roles. Yeah. However, most of them are engineers or developers, right? They know how to write code. And most of them are security companies. So they understand what secure software is. And also most of them they have the aspiration, or they already do, selling into large companies. And the large companies are what, on the receiving end, are what set standards, right? So, coming from, put on the other hat, which is board of director for a large company, I won't scrutinize each individual vendors, for instance, as a board. But we would ask our technology leadership to understand which vendors, which services that we are critically dependent upon, right? And then we will challenge the technology leadership of the company to say, hey, we are critically dependent on these services. You better make sure these services are produced securely, they have the right secure development framework behind it, and they know how to manage their risks in terms of security before we sign on the dotted line to be their customers, because we're downstream from their risks, right? So, and that conversation is fairly new in the boardroom, and it's also fairly new in the client and producer relationship. And going back to my investor hat, my portfolio companies are increasingly being asked to produce evidence that their software or services are produced securely according to certain secure standards. If you're working with government entities, will be the Secure Development Framework, which is NIST 218, I think, 800 218. And you need to produce evidence that that is done. And you need to also now being asked to produce evidence that your upstream services, your upstream libraries that you're using are also secure. And that is from, if I'm the ultimate consumer of software, I ask my upstream vendors and they ask their upstream vendors. So that is how we create this groundswell for the requirements to go to the original producers of software, whoever they are, to write secure software, that is.
Yeah. Good pivot to bring that back around. That's what I wanted to do. And it's partially right. It's for, and we hear me talking about this with sort of the manager hat on frequently, Mike, about, why are we doing these things, or when do we wait, or when do we not? But I thought it'd be interesting to think for a second about our developers who are listening to us when their boss says, hey, I need you to think about, actually making sure we don't have any SQL injection in here, cross-site scripting, or these type of things, or as we're talking today, software supply chain. It's not just someone like making busy work, right? It's not just purely, oh my God, we don't want to be hacked. It's someone's boss's boss, or a customer or someone else is saying, we're not going to buy your software unless you actually go to more than just a minimal amount of effort on these things. So this is, I think, partially why we're sort of banging this drum continuously around some of these aspects. It's personally interesting to me right now on how early someone starts thinking about doing the spend for security. But yeah, I agree with you. It's probably A or B where it gets someone serious comes along and thinking about that. But anyways.
In the past, I think developers didn't care, right? Or some of them still don't care. It's like they would be like, make me care, right? My boss, my manager is not telling me to do this. They're telling me to basically meet the deadline of go to market, right? And I can care less about anything else if I couldn't meet the deadline. But right now, I think, what's a little bit been changing is that customers been coming to providers say, hey, I need this. I don't just need you to meet the deadline, but I need you to meet the deadline with these requirements. And one of those is security. And when customers asking, and when your large customers asking, you listen, and then that gets to the top management level, and then gets to the head of engineering, then that's percolate down to developers. So ultimately, developers will have to do things that speak to the customer.
Yeah, I think that last part is the great point to really emphasize that you had mentioned earlier. There's small organizations, but then and big organizations, and they may approach how they're doing the security a little bit differently because they have different budgets, different just tools available to them. But even if you're a small org, and if you want to sell to customers, especially the big ones with larger checkbooks, they're going to push you to require this. So I'm curious too, as we talk about you'd mentioned too, like the NIST Secure Development Framework. Are there what are the ways that boards or just CISOs in general just kind of answer that question about, did you develop this securely? Because it's definitely a risk management question. It's a measure of confidence that I think is still, to this day, still much more of a qualitative type of question rather than a quantitative one. So are there certain things that you lean into or that you try to encourage companies to focus on to demonstrate to that aspect of trust that, yes, we did have an attention to security as we're developing the software?
Right. So I mentioned earlier there's a NIST framework on secure development, secure software development, and that is one that some of the vendor assessment framework would ask, do you follow this, and can you attest that your organizations your organization follows this guideline. So that's one. Secondly is, these days we are hearing more and more about SBOM, right? Software Bill of Materials. SBOM is really a concept that's developed because we now understand there are several layers of depth in terms of dependency, software dependency, and some of them is like more than several layers deep, right? And to unpack this, to be able to unpack this and understand Log4j, for instance, right? How many organizations knew that I had this library in my on my sort of the backend log server, right? Not many do before Log4j became an issue, right? So what we are asking, what the SBOM framework is allowing people to do is to say, hey, really unpack the software for me and let me understand what are the leaf nodes. If you think about, it's a tree, right? Your software depending on these libraries depending on others. What are the leaf nodes that I'm ultimately dependent upon? And are they, are they of the right version, for instance? Are they free of vulnerabilities that I care about? And are they coming from the right source, right? Are they really from the official upstream distribution point of the open source, or came from some third party? And have they been through secure development framework, and can I trust it, coming from the right provenance? So those are the questions that you're able to ask now that SBOM is in the picture. And there are still a lot of nuances with SBOM, but at least that's the starting point for us to start to unpack your software supply chain.
Part of that too, I think, is especially for smaller companies, and it's a lot easier to pick up SaaS services. So just look at GitHub, GitLab, for example, that can possibly have some GitHub Actions. Your CI/CD pipeline can help build out that SBOM, but you're also now depending on these SaaS services. Then these services themselves don't necessarily have an SBOM of their own that says this is how we built the service. How has that also been part of this calculation, or are boards even thinking ahead this far yet?
You're absolutely right. So when we talk about software supply chain, we always think about, we're using somebody else's software that's they package, they deliver, and we install down our, laptops and servers. But SaaS services is also a software service, and they develop their services using software, using third-party libraries, and that's absolutely one of your attack surface. So I actually been, every time I get on the phone with someone who's a SaaS provider, I ask them, hey, are your customers asking you for SBOM for your services? And I would say probably fewer than actual software providers, those that ship software, right? A lot fewer, in fact. But it's not unheard of. They have been, some of them have been asked, and even those who have not been asked is looking at this as something they have to do in the near future. So it is happening, and it's not happening fast enough, I have to say.
I'm trying to come up with a good segue here, because we're talking about not happening fast enough, what the future could look like. But let me take us a hard turn to the past. And this past is, for example, you helped found the cybersecurity lab at Carnegie Mellon, and your PhD is in computer science. And clearly you care about security, you know about security, you're investing in security. But I'm going to suspect that maybe your security education at the universities wasn't as great as it could have been. What do you see? How much of a gap do you see? Do you see that there is a big gap in that security aspect of computer science?
It's a good question, because I went through classic computer science training myself, and then I was a professor, and I was on the other side of teaching computer science and computer engineering. I have to say that the security education I got was a lot more about the foundations of computer security, such as applied crypto, sort of a architectural level of security, but really a lot less about how do you write secure software. For better or for worse, some of it in higher education, some of the things are, the more theoretical things are considered sort of academic enough to be taught, but the how to write software and how to write securely, I still consider more the tactical engineering, more vocational sort of an aspect of computer science that's not always taught. And those turn out to be like extremely useful aspect when you go to industry. Like you have to know how to write good software, how to write quality software and secure software. So I think academia has a little bit of catch up to do. And now, of course, that's why there is a market for software development education in industry. A lot of us learn it on the job and how to write, and senior developers will teach you how to write secure, at least quality software. And now we have requirements to do secure software development training. Right? And so those are the things that I think academia should do more of.
Yeah, and part of the reason I ask is so that we have more of that grounded education. So developers, not necessarily to say, I think maybe sometimes a little unfairly, they don't care about security, but maybe they haven't been taught security principles, those engineering aspects. And you touched on a little bit of the security education within organizations, which sounds like it's one of those areas of investment because we haven't picked on a specific tool. And I think it's quite fairly, you can't buy a tool to solve any of your specific security problems. So I'm curious then if you have a discussion with a CISO, discussion with a board, what are the ways that you educate them on why the security is important, and maybe not so much why it's important, but how you're going to demonstrate that the investment was better? And here I'm thinking of, sure, you're going to have to buy a tool at some point, or you're going to have to do some type of security champions program, security awareness program. Do you just show we had 80% of our developers attend 1 hour of training this year, and that was our metric of success, or something perhaps a little bit more insightful?
Well, so training training, if it's sort of completely separate from your day-to-day job, doesn't work. We have to have training as part of your development workflow. For instance, if the training is take you away and watch an hour video, very little will stick with you. What it needs to do is have the training embedded in the code that you are developing anyway, and to tell you that, here there's a SQL, could be a SQL injection. Here's maybe a lack of authentication, lack of validation of the input range. Those are the things that will stick with a developer because you're doing it anyway and you're looking at it. So the problem with traditional training is, it doesn't speak to the task at hand. And if we can infuse software development, secure software development practices into the task at hand, I think that will get more developers into security camp.
Yeah, so focusing on the context of where people work, which is part of what you were also describing is the context of tools working best for developers. So sort of from looking at this through your investor lens, looking at companies, to invest in, how much do you see these companies producing or focusing on, call them their personas? I know like sales and marketing like to use that term, for CISOs versus CTOs. And a little bit where I'm going with this is just the idea of the changing role of AppSec. Maybe these quote unquote AppSec tools really aren't being used by AppSec folks, and the AppSec a year from now, 5 years from now is going to be a little or a lot different. How do you see that evolving?
I think it's changing quite a bit. Those of us who are investors are hopefully we're looking at cutting edge technology, right? So I'm not aware of anyone is funding new AppSec tools that are designed just for AppSec engineers. A lot of us are looking at AppSec tools used by developers. In fact, we ask very stringent questions about, where's the result of scanning going? How do you tap into the CI/CD pipeline? Are the results going to come out as a pull request into the developer's lens, right? Where do developers live? They live in IDE, they live in Git, they live in Jira, right? They don't live in any other console. If you're going to return the results in a separate console to those three, forget it. Nobody's going to take a look. So how do you tap into the normal workflow? How do you sort of communicate the result of application security assessment is a big thing. And then how do you effect the remediation workflow is another big thing. So I think you'll see the next generation tools very different from the old AppSec tools.
Then what about sort of that AppSec role then, or maybe even that concept? I can imagine some of the AppSec folks might just switch to that developer side, jump in to say, hey, I do want to continue this engineering. I'll do that integration, or maybe I'll even just start building some of the software. So that's an engineering aspect, but there's still going to be, I suppose, a governance aspect, communication metrics, or something else. Are there still, as you see security programs being designed, how do you see those changing? Are there or are there ways that you would suggestions you'd have for an audience, for a small org or a larger org to start rethinking how they're approaching their programs?
So, we talked a lot about how AppSec should be designed for developers. And this is not to say, if you're an AppSec engineer, you're going to be out of their job soon. I don't want to be that negative. Rather, I think what is happening is the trend is pointing to AppSec and development being more blending together. So we see a lot of AppSec teams sort of becoming subset of a development team, or a senior developer will pick up the security champion role, right? What that means is in the future, I think a lot more sort of AppSec tasks, or at least some of those more for sort of developer-focused tasks, going to be done purely by development. And what's left to do for AppSec-centric roles are things like detection of very insidious risks and threats that are not sort of detectable by maybe just regular development teams. So those things will still be there, but will be more concentrated, more narrowly focused. And I think that's a good thing. Good thing for the community, where more developers doing security. So we get more eyes on AppSec. And really that's what we want to do.
Oh, absolutely. And I think maybe one last sort of parting question as we're running towards the end of the segment, unfortunately, whether you're looking at this from the very specific developer perspective, or your hat as a security leadership, or even as a board advisor, is there something that you would love to see people addressing more, people investing in, so that maybe I'm really just kind of saying, what's an optimistic look forward for the AppSec future if we could do X to solve a particular problem? Or maybe this is a little bit of a not too subtle pitch on what's a missing tool out there that we should be building.
Well, it's a pretty broad question, I guess. So one of the things, sorry, I got pulled. My next meeting is pulling me. So the one of the things is increasing the awareness of AppSec, right? So education, training programs that are part of your workflows are really important. Another thing is understand how your team can sort of get your expertise set up to do SBOM generation, SBOM management for your software consumers on the downstream, and participate as part of this trend of software supply chain security risk management, which is pushed by the President's Office and as well as NIST, right? So understand what those guidance and requirements are asking you to do, and be proactive about putting some of these functionality in your strategies, in your processes. That would be the thing I recommend people to do.
That's awesome. Your time is important. We thank you very much for spending some of that time with us, Chenxi. We appreciate it greatly.
Thank you, and it's fun. So happy to do this again.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our listeners. Thanks to John as well. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.